Okay, in this next tutorial we're going to use the same scene that we were working with before, or actually at the same point when we finished with the camera animation set in and everything. But what we're going to do this time is we're going to render this particular one out to a print res version of this particular one. So for example, we've got like a specific point, say roughly around about there, that we want to use this as a particular like point of sale internal environment. So instead of actually calculating everything with regards to print sizes and everything, what we can do is we can literally just use Max's own print size wizard, which is a nice little handy script that was incorporated in Max not so long ago, which allows us to just specify in millimeters or inches how wide we actually want the print to be. Now by default you'd normally want to use a 300 dpi image, and then we can actually give in millimeters a rough guesstimate on how wide we actually want our image to be. Now obviously we've got specific custom sizes, like for example ABCD, A4. Let's just use a standard A4 size, so that gives us a default width and height, which is obviously grayed out because we're using a preset in millimeters, and we obviously want to use 300 dpi. Now what we can do is go to the render scene dialog by clicking this. So basically you click this and it closes this particular window and will automatically take us straight to the render scene dialog panel, which is just a standard render panel, or quick render, which will literally just render this out as is without going via the scene dialog. Now personally I would say go to the render scene dialog, because that will basically spit in all the relevant settings. Obviously we don't get a DPI value in now because it renders it out by default to 72 DPI. However, when we actually print out via Photoshop or any other print package, you simply specify the millimeter size and the DPI and it will render out properly. So first things first is I'm going to use show safe frame. So that basically gives us what we're actually going to see in the final print. So the problem is that, well, two things. One is that some of our detail and our geometry isn't going to be high enough for print quality, and also our shadows are going to be not as good for print quality either. So those are two things that we're going to need to up for starters. Secondly, the resulting render is going to be slightly not very aesthetically pleasing. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to go into Photoshop and color correct it slightly before we actually output it to print. So first things first, what we need to do is, because we're actually in midway through an animation, we're going to have motion blur enabled still. So two things we could do to actually get rid of this. One is by selecting all the geometry, right clicking, going to properties and disabling image motion blur by clicking on that. However, an easier solution is simply going to the render panel and just turning it off. However, if you go back in and re-render it with motion, you want motion blur back in, you're obviously going to have to turn that back on. So don't forget that you actually turn that off. Otherwise, when you render it, if you render this out, you make some tweaks and render it out as an animation, then you aren't going to have motion blur. So you need to make sure that's turned back on. So what we have at this particular point, if I just click render, is a very large canvas. Obviously you're viewing this at a quarter zoom at the moment, so the actual size is that big. So it is obviously going to take a little bit of time to obviously render this out. You'll see that some of the detail here in the geometry isn't all that good. It doesn't hold up all that well for print size. So obviously this type of thing needs to be sorted out. This isn't coming out all too bad. You can actually see the detail in the cupboards now. But some of the shadows, which when we come down to the wall, once it gets there, it's like waiting for Christmas, isn't it? Let's go across to the side, see if we've got anything else. Again, we've got basically some polygon edging visible here, which obviously needs attending to. Yeah, this area kind of thing here, and also when we actually come down to it, we've got some areas around this particular region which doesn't look too clean. So what we'll need to do is to up the shadow map quality to compensate for this. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go in and do that right now. Just cancel that. So, easy way to do this. Let's go into our light lister. First off, the direct sun. What we'll do is we'll bump that up to 4096, and because we've doubled that, we need to double this. We'll put that up to 16. Teapot Omni. I'd say let's put that up to 512, and then we'll increase the sample range accordingly. We'll put that up to 40. The walls, again, 512, putting that up to 40 as well. And the floor, exactly the same. Again, doubling the sample range. And the skylight, again, 512. And we'll bump that up to 40 as well. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a render region, and then click render, and then it asks me what region I actually want to render. So I just want to do this little bit here, just to see, because I know this area is going to be a problem area because of the detachment in the shadows that I mentioned before. And then click OK, and that will calculate the shadows. If you notice, it's flickering because that's doing 6 shadows per light. Now ignore any of the background here, ignore all this. Actually, what I'll do is I'll clear the render and then tell it to render. Let's just set that going again. Ooh. It's asking for me to OK it. And it should just render out that one particular little region. So now we're starting to get some tighter shadows around this area around here. We've still got a slight little line there, if you can notice that. However, I think that for the most part that's forgivable. In the final render, what you would more than likely want to do is to increase the amount of lights in the scene, maybe drop the shadow amounts down, the shadow sizes down proportionally. So if you double the amount of lights in the scene, you might want to double the so you might want to half the amount of shadows back to what they originally were, just so you can bring out this darker area around here. So you want to stick a light behind that cavity and one behind this wardrobe here as well, so you've got everything illuminated uniformly. But that's not coming out too bad. Again, this object needs to be improved, so let's just quickly go in and sort that out. So if I go to the perspective viewport, I'm just going to zoom in to this guy here. It's a group, so I'm just going to open the group, grab hold of one of the knobs, as it's lovingly called, and that's part of a group as well. So I basically want to grab hold of that, and what I need to do is I need to increase the amount of segments in it. So because they're doing it in that one, it's doing it to all of them because they're all instants. So that's what I was saying earlier on about making sure that if you've got objects the same, make sure they're instances, otherwise you will have to go through every single knob in the scene and increase its amount of segments, which can be a bit of a painstaking operation. So I'm just going to crank that up to 32, and we've got too much linear edging here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back down to the base level, and I'm going to increase the interpolation. So I'm going to drop that up to about 3, so that should make a fair amount of difference. Next thing is, because the teapot is also quite linear when it actually comes to the actual final render, what I'm going to do is I'm going to also increase that. I'm going to increase, let's put it on 64, a bit too much, put it up to 32. Now obviously this is going to increase the render times, basically because there's going to be more ray tracing geometry needs to be calculated. So this will actually produce a fairly good clean render at the end of the day. What I'll also do now is I'm going to again pause the render, so therefore you don't have to wait for it, and then what I'll do is I'll take it straight into Photoshop, and then we'll start color correcting. Right, a couple of cups of tea later, including a bacon sandwich and an episode of Deal or No Deal, and we've got our final render. So what we need to do now is, if you look at it, it looks slightly alias, but basically that's because we're actually zoomed in. So if you zoom in back to our 100% level, we can see that the render's pretty clean. Apart from the teapot, you can notice we've got some aliasing lines on here, which is due to, as I mentioned previously, the reflections aren't anti-alias by default, so obviously you need to enable super sampling on that if you need to, but for this example it's okay. So what we'll do, we'll save this out, and let's call it teapot in bedroom raw, and we'll save it out as a bitmap file, which we can then switch to Photoshop, and we can load in the relevant where are we? Oh no, wrong folder, it's on the desktop. We can load in the render. Okay, a couple of things we can do to actually fix this, to clean it up and make it look a lot nicer for the final print. Firstly, we've got some light areas that we can basically go in and clear up and add a bit of extra bloom to, that kind of thing. So first off, to do that, what we can do is duplicate the layer, and what we'll do is then, to this particular duplicate, is we'll adjust the levels, which basically means we can adjust brightness and contrast. So what I want to do is I want to bring all this lot in, so we've basically got these light areas visible. So we want to create like a bit of a haze, a bit of a glow around this area, not necessarily on this cupboard door. So what we'll do in a second is paint this out, so we've literally got this area that's kind of got a bit of a glow onto it. So if I just adjust that a little bit more, okay, so all this kind of lit area here, just put that back up and then bring that out so we can see everything. Right, so all this lot around here we can literally get rid of. We might keep the teapot because we might be able to put a little bit of a glow on that. So right, using the lasso tool, what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to go around and just draw around there pretty roughly. So I've got a selection, I missed a bit there, so holding down shift, just going to add that bit in, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the layer again, hide the original so I can basically come back to the teapot if I need to, and then I'm going to fill the rest of all this lot in black. So I'm going to hit D to reset the colors in case I've got like some strange, you know, red in there or whatever. Press D to reset the colors, then hold down Alt and press backspace at the same time, and that will fill in using the top color. Hold down Control and press D to deselect the selection. So that's just got our window in now. So what I can do now to emphasize the window in the bottom layer is I can change this layer blending type to screen. So if I turn that on and off, you can see a difference in intensity, because that's adding the brightness of this layer onto that one, because that one's transparent at the moment. And then we'll do this a couple of times or so, and then to get a kind of like a hazy effect, what we'll do is we'll add a Gaussian blur to each one. So if I just pick this area here and zoom back a touch, we can actually see how intense our blur needs to be. So I'm going to start off, do this multiple times, doubling the actual radius each time. So first off, I think I'm going to start with, we'll start with a value of 20 on this one. The next one, I'm going to do a value of 40. The next one, I'm going to double 40, so that's a value of 80. And the next one, I'm going to do that one with a value of 160. Okay, so I've got this kind of like hazy effect in there now. So I can then link all these together, and then holding down Control and pressing E, that basically collapses the entire lot down together. Again, it's flattened it and put it back to normal, so I want to put that back to screen, and then I can see exactly what the type of hazy effect that I've got now. So it's looking quite nice. Might want to do it again, so duplicate that. Bit too bright, a bit too uniform as well, so I want to blur that even more. So I want to take that even further. So let's say, let's do it about, let's double it, 320. So that should, oh, maximum of 250. Okay, so we'll go up to 250 then. Takes a second to do because it's a large image, and then we get this nice kind of hazy effect that we can then collapse down and is now applied to our total image. Now obviously we want to do a little bit to the teapot, so let's just hide that, bring that back up, and then we can zoom in, grab a rough outline of the teapot. We don't need much of that green, if any at all. Just get around there. Then I can just add in, hold down shift, add in the teapot spout, get rid of that bit because we don't need it, get rid of that bit as well, and let's get rid of, oh, wrong one, let's get rid of that because we just need this area to screen, and it's only concentrating on the light areas anyway. So what I can do then is just extract this one particular selection just by holding down Control and pressing J. So that is just this guy here. So again, same principle as before. Screen it as before, so let's do that a couple of times. So this one, I want to do this quite a substantial amount now, so I'm going to do this one at let's say do it at about 40. This one I want to do it at about 80. This one I want to do it at about 160, and the other one again I want to do it at about 250 because that's obviously the highest we can go. So it kind of gives us a nice haze to simulate air density, and also gives us a nice effect to it. Now if this is looking a little bit too red, what we can basically do is we can either change the layer blending times to, say for example, if you want to do it as a color dodge, which is obviously a bit too intense, or we can, actually no, let's put it back to, let's try a linear dodge, and then what we can do is we can adjust the saturation of the color, drop that down so it's more white, and then let's see if we can duplicate that again. Let's see what happens there. It's a little bit too intense, so I think what we'll do is we might leave it as is. So what we've got is we've got this kind of like hazy effect around the highlight here, and then got a hazy effect around that highlight there. So that's solution one. Okay, so the next thing we can do is we can go through and we can color correct the entire thing. So to do that, two ways we can do it. One is by using what's called a layer adjustment. So what that does is that applies levels or other color correction effects like adjusting curves, color balance, brightness and contrast, and so on. And what that does is it does it to everything beneath it, or if you hold down Alt, you can basically just assign it just to one particular layer. So what we'll do is we'll do it for the entire lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into the levels, and that's going to do it for the entire lot. So one quick fix, depending on the color range, is you can just do an auto levels, and that kind of what that basically does is if I undo that, what it does is it basically goes to the nearest for red, green and blue. What it does is it basically brings in, so this is a shadow area, this is your highlight area, and what it basically does is it pulls in, so that's the extent of your shadows there, that's the extent of the dark areas for the blues. So what it does is it basically pulls in for each one like that, and the same on the other side. So that will come to about there, so that'll pull that in there like that. So in essence, that's basically what auto levels does. So that gives you a little bit of control, not a great deal of control, and it's kind of like an automated procedure. So what we can do is we can go in and we can tweak, say, the mid-tones to warm it up a little bit. Maybe drop the green as well. Just to give it a little of extra warmth, and maybe bring up the blacks a little bit so it's not so intense, and increase the whites so it's a lot more dreamy and picturesque. Okay, so the difference between that and the original is quite substantial. So finally, what we can also do is we can apply a photo filter, so we can add like warming filters, additional rares. So you can notice the color change is quite subtle. So for this, I would basically suggest we add like a subtle warming filter, and we can just add just a touch to it, and that kind of finishes off the result. Finally, just add a little bit of grain. Now the thing is with grain or noise effects, it basically applies it to a flattened image. Now obviously we don't really want to flatten the entire image, because otherwise we basically lose, we can't go back in if the client says, oh, we need to actually drop the photo filter or drop the levels. You've baked it all in, and you have a problem. So what we're going to do is just go to and pick a mid grey, which is one of these little swatches here, and then flood fill the entire thing just by holding down Alt and pressing backspace. We can then, if we zoom right in, we can go to noise, we can add some noise. So we've got basically a subtle amount. I'm just using a very, very small amount of Gaussian, which should be quite sufficient. If it's too much, what we can do is we can just drop the opacity of it. So to add this to the rest of the image, what we can just do is use an overlay filter. So it kind of breaks it up a little bit. So the main difference between the two, if we can see, so that's with, that's without. So it kind of brings up the midtones a little bit as well. So what we could even do actually is just drop that beneath there. So the photo filter and the levels is applied to the noise as well. Now it might be a little bit too much, so what we can do is we could just Gaussian it very, very slightly, just like a 0.5 on it, just to smooth it out a little bit and make it look a little bit more like a photo than it was originally. It'll also help hide any problems. Finally, last thing to do is because we've got these really hard linear edges, we can basically just add a very slight amount of blur, just a little bit. That's too much. We want to bring in a 0.5 blur to the entire image, just to break up any hard edges. So it's now ready for print, and that's our finished image. So all we need to do then is save a copy. Well, first off, we would save the entire thing. So that's the PSD, so we can come back and change it if needs be. And the other version, once it's finished saving, next one we would do is we would save a flattened version. Now we can save it as a bitmap, EPS file, JPEG. I won't really use JPEGs because you're going to get some compression problems unless you're doing a web delivery, or a TIFF or a target. I would basically use a bitmap because that kind of ticks all the boxes. So teapot in bedroom, final. So that is literally our final version. Just saving that out. Once it finishes. Here we go. So I'm obviously recording at the same time, so a lot of the processor power is actually going into the recorder as well. Plus I've also got Max up still. And finish writing it. So to double check, the image size is currently 3507 pixels by 2480. Now you'll notice that the DPI, sorry, the width and the height has changed to what we originally set in. That's the reason being is because the actual resolution is set to 72 pixels per inch. Now that's the actual output that Max natively saves. It only saves at 72 DPI. The only format that Max will save with a DPI change is an EPS file. Max will actually save out an EPS file if you really wanted to. Not really much point, to be honest, but where is it? Here we are somewhere. I believe EPS file, yeah. You can save it as it's basically an image version of an EPS file. Now a native EPS file is obviously, as you know, a digital file like an AI or a WMF. But that's the only format that actually holds a DPI value. So what you'd need to do is we'd need to we don't want to resample the thing. Actually, no, we don't want to redo that. Let's just cancel that. Let's go back in, take that off. So anything we really want to do is just put that back up to 300. So we've got our proper dimensions in. Okay, that we'll resave that Photoshop file out. So we've got it set in stone. And then we'll also save out the bitmap as well. So that's done. So that is now ready for print. So when you actually print that thing out, it will be at the proper size, fit an A4 sheet, and look not bad at all. That's your lot. Catch you later.